I want to speak today about what I consider to be the way forward in psychoanalysis. And I want to speak about the issues of science and truth in psychoanalysis today. Some colleagues seem to be of the opinion that the only way that psychoanalysis can achieve any real scientific status is through the emerging field of neuropsychoanalysis, grounding psychoanalytic insights in studies of the brain. And I profoundly disagree with this because psychoanalysis is about the mind. It is not about the brain. Now, of course, the mind relies on the brain, depends upon the brain, is grounded in the brain, but it represents a level of organization, emergent organization, irreducible to the brain itself. The analogy that I always use is the distinction between the TV program and the TV set. If you don't like the program, it usually doesn't make much sense to call the television repairman, because the problem is not in the set, it's in the program. It would make more sense to write to the directors and demand better actors and better writers, etc. So there's a fundamental confusion of levels here. Advances in neuropsychoanalysis, like advances in any science, are to be celebrated, are valuable contributions to knowledge. But psychoanalysis has to pursue its own domain, the emergent realm of the mind, the psyche. So if we shift our attention to so-called neuropsychoanalysis, we're going to lose our minds. We're going to lose the psyche. So that's not the way forward to achieve scientific status. What then is the way forward to achieve scientific status? For a time, psychoanalysis, at least in North America, operated within one dominant paradigm, perspective, or school of thought, that is, the Freudian. But certainly by the 1950s or early 1960s, psychoanalysis was splintering into a range of competing schools of thought. It became a multi-paradigm science. You had the Freudians, you had the Kleinians, you had the Cohoutians, you had the Lacanians, you had the relational intersubjectivity theorists, and they stopped talking to one another. They tended to stay within their own silos. Now, while postmodern relativists might be okay with this situation, because they abandon the idea of universal or unitary truth. Sometimes they abandon the notion of truth altogether, where the notion of truth is reduced to a perspective embraced by a particular group of people. And this relativization of what we mean by truth, or this subjectivization of what we mean by truth, that is, truth for you, truth for me, truth for someone else, to me this is entirely incompatible with a scientific attitude. In my view, science pursues unitary truth, recognizing that it is very difficult to arrive at any of this, but that remains the goal. Settling for multiple truths, settling for the view of truth as subjectivity, is the abandonment of a scientific attitude, as far as I'm concerned. So, how do we arrive at truth? How do we arrive at science in psychoanalysis? Or how does psychoanalysis evolve to the point where it can be legitimately considered a science? It is through cross-silo dialogue. The representatives of each of the schools need to come out of their silos and engage in prolonged and deep dialogue with people from the other schools of thought. Now, this has begun to a considerable degree. 2 volumes of what have been called Klein-Lacan dialogues have been published. This is the way we need to go. So I'm speaking here about comparative psychoanalysis, a dialogue among representatives of the different schools. At the Toronto Institute, we tried that a number of years ago. We established a third-year continuous case seminar at which a candidate would present for 10 weeks, one case, but there were 2 training analysts in the seminar, one representing Freudian Kleinian approaches, me, and a colleague who represented self-relational intersubjectivity theory. We thought the sparks would fly, but they didn't, because although he and I spoke different languages, in reality we zeroed in on exactly the same points in the clinical material that was being presented. We found the same points to be of interest, and we found the same points that were problematic. And we talked about them in our own languages, but we were getting at pretty much the same things. Now, I'm not saying this is always the case. It is not always the case. Sometimes the different perspectives truly differ, and not just in language. But of course, the language problem is severe. People use the same words to refer to very different things. So we certainly need to refine our vocabulary so that we stop talking past one another. This linguistic problem is very important and needs to be dealt with in order to further this comparative and progressive dialogue. Points of view that are often considered completely incompatible, say Kleinian and Cohoutian theory, which are often seen as as incompatible as oil and water, but they really aren't. When you look at them closely, you find that Klein and Kohut share pretty much the same theory of the cure, namely internalization of a good, whole good object, a building up of an inner sense of goodness over time. Internalization. Okay, there is a good deal of agreement on a number of things across the schools, but it's not all agreement. The schools have also seen very different things, and some of these differences are pretty fundamental and important. So we need to study both similarities and real divergences. This is the task of a comparative psychoanalysis. that is not merely comparing and contrasting, but is also trying to determine truth. Which of these perspectives, when they diverge, is closer to the truth? Which of these perspectives is more comprehensive? Which of these perspectives is more accurate in certain areas, while the other schools will be more accurate and more comprehensive in other areas? Now, this is an enormously complex task. It's difficult enough to master Freud, but then to have to master Klein, and then to have to master Kohut, and then Lacan, and then relational and intersubjectivity theory. It's a very daunting task, but it really can't be avoided, because we really can't settle for the idea that truth is subjectivity, that there is no overarching unitary truth. There is only your truth and my truth. There is only the truth evolved by this particular, or co-constructed by this particular analytic dyad, and the truth evolved by other analytic dyads. This kind of relativism is simply deeply unsatisfactory, and to settle for this would certainly prevent psychoanalysis from ever really meriting the status of psychological science. So it's not merely a matter of anything goes. It's not merely a matter of saying that every analyst brings his personal subjectivity to the work and therefore works in his own particular way and arrives with the patient at their own particular co-constructed truths. This is certainly not the way forward scientifically. Science is a matter of an ongoing dialogue within the scientific community, whereby particular perspectives emerge and become validated, and others drop by the wayside. I believe that psychoanalysis is an evolutionary theory, and as in biological evolution, there is something like the survival of the fittest. Theories compete, and some are revealed as stronger, better, more accurate, more comprehensive, more useful, and other theories prove not to be as accurate, not to be as comprehensive, and they tend to fall by the wayside. So out of this ongoing dialogue comes a kind of competition, and we move gradually and progressively forward to a vision transcending each of the individual perspectives. Now, I'm not at all denying the subjective basis of psychoanalytic ideas. Freud had a doozy of an Oedipus complex, an old father who was 40 when Freud was born, a young mother who was 20. The very intensity of his Oedipus complex enabled him to see the Oedipus complex, which, like him, I regard as universal, taking many different forms and shapes in different family situations and in different cultures, but nevertheless, the fundamental triangular jealousy complex, I think, is transcultural, transhistorical. For reasons of attachment, we attach to the mother, and we don't want to share her with fathers, siblings, or if we're Trobrianders, we resent the importance her brother has for her. So there's something universal that Freud was able to discover because of the very intensity of his own Oedipus conflict. The same can be said for Melanie Klein. She struggled throughout her life with depression, and as a result of that, she was in a position to be able to see the importance, the centrality of the processes of splitting, and the importance of the overcoming of splitting and the achievement of ambivalence, and then the problems that arise from that very ambivalence. She struggled with aggression and anger and hostility, and all of this enabled her to understand what she came to call the paranoid schizoid position and then the depressive position. Well, actually, the chronological sequence is reversed. She first mapped the depressive position and only later came to understand the earlier and more primitive paranoid schizoid position. Heinz Kohut, from all accounts, was a pretty narcissistic fellow, and that enabled him to put together a range of important insights into narcissism and into the so-called fragmentation-prone self and into the disintegration products to which the fragmentation-prone self turns in its attempt to put itself together again. It enabled him to understand the narcissist's longing for what he called self-object function. A range of insights that to me represent real contributions, but the problem, of course, is that Kohut took his army and broke off communication with headquarters and went off on his own instead of understanding that what he had seen represents an important piece of the truth, but only a piece, and that this piece should be laid side by side with the Kleinian piece, and the Freudian piece, and the Lacanian piece, so that ultimately these pieces could be seen to be parts of an emerging higher understanding of truth. So yes, psychoanalytic theory has a strong subjective basis, as I guess all scientific theory probably does. But the subjective origins of ideas is quite a separate issue from the question of the objectivity or the truth value contained in these ideas. Some of my subjective ideas are pretty much confined to me and people with very similar experience as mine, but sometimes my subjectivity overlaps in significant ways with the subjectivity of others, and therefore has some wider implication. And so yes, psychoanalytic theories are produced by, in and through the subjectivity of their creators, but they have seen pieces of a more comprehensive truth. And it's our job to collect these elements and to arrange them over time into a more comprehensive understanding of the human psyche. Speaking clinically, therefore, it's absolutely essential that candidates, that beginning therapists and analysts be exposed to all of the major schools of psychoanalytic thought. Now, this is a daunting task. It's hard enough to master Freud, then to have to master Klein, then to have to master Kohut, Mitchell, Benjamin, Stollerow et al. This is a very tall order. Becoming validly educated in psychoanalysis is a complex and difficult task. And the problem is that the poor candidate is sitting with patients and trying to figure out how to understand them, and trying to figure out how to be of help. And so it's natural that candidates are tempted to glom on to one or another of the paradigms to get a sense of identity, to get a sense of knowing what he or she is doing. It's natural to close one's minds to other complicated truths. It's too complex. It's overwhelming, and so there is this tendency to specialize and to become a Freudian or a Kleinian or a Kohutian. I guess this is natural. It's probably unavoidable to some degree, but there should be major pressure from evolved analysts, people who have been in the field for decades and have studied all of the paradigms, or at least more than one of the paradigms, and are in a position to point out the limitations of this one paradigm and what is contributed by the other paradigms, so that as people mature in psychoanalysis, they can let go of the security of remaining within one silo and come outdoors and encounter people from the other silos and dialogue with them and learn about the piece of the truth that they have discovered. This is what we need to do in psychoanalysis, and this is what will evolve a truly scientific psychoanalysis that lets go of and mourns the lost security of remaining within a particular school of thought, and that opens itself up to the uncertainty and the complexity of encountering alternative schools of thought, and that struggles to work out that ever-evolving, never-final synthesis. A psychoanalysis that is working in this way, it seems to me, deserves to be considered a science.